All right, friends, welcome back to the final segment of Island of the Blue Dolphins. Hope you've enjoyed hearing this book. I've really enjoyed reading it, so let's see how it ends. Chapter 25. The Aleuts never came to the Island of the Blue Dolphins, but every summer I watched for them. And early spring I gathered shellfish, which I dried and stored in the cave where I kept my canoe. 2 winters after they left, I made more weapons, a spear, a bow, and a quiver of arrows. These I also stored in the place beneath the headland, so if the hunters returned, I would be ready to go to another part of the island to move from cave to cave, living in my canoe if necessary. For many summers after the Aleuts had gone, the herd of otter left Coral Cove. The old otter, which had survived the Aleut spears and by now were aware that summer was a time of danger, would lead the herd away. They went far off to the kelp beds of Tall Rock, where they stayed until the first storms of winter. Often Rontu and I would go out to the rock and live there for several days, catching fish for Wanani and the others that I had come to know. One summer the otter did not leave, the summer that Rontu died, and I knew then that none of the otter who remembered the hunters were left. Nor did I think of them often, nor of the white men who had said that they would come back, but did not come. Until that summer, I had kept count of all the moons since the time my brother and I were alone upon the island. For each one that came and went, I cut a mark in a pole beside the door of my house. There were many marks from the roof to the floor, but after that summer, I did not cut them any more. The passing of the moons now had come to mean little, and I only made marks to count the 4 seasons of the year. The last year I did not count those. It was late in the summer that Rontu died. The days since spring, whenever I went to the reef to fish, he would not go with me, unless I urged him to. He liked to lie in the sun in front of the house, and I let him, but I did not go so often as in the past. I remember the night that Rontu stood at the fence and barked for me to let him out. Usually, he did this when the moon was big, and he came back in the morning, but that night there was no moon, and he did not return. I waited all that day for him, until almost dusk, and then I went out to look for him. I saw his tracks, and I followed them over the dunes, and a hill to the lair where he had once lived. There I found him, lying in the back of the cave, alone. At first, I thought he'd been hurt, yet there were no wounds on him. He touched my hand with his tongue, but only once, and then he was quiet and scarcely breathed. Since night had fallen, and it was too dark for me to carry Rontu back, I stayed there. I sat beside him through the night, and I talked to him. At dawn, I took him in my arms, and I left the cave. He was very light, as if something about him had already gone. The sun was up as I went along the cliff. Gulls were crying in the sky. He raised his ears at the sound, and I put him down, thinking that he wished to bark at them as he always did. He raised his head and followed them with his eyes, but did not make a sound. "Rontu," I said, "you have always liked to bark at the seagulls. Whole mornings and afternoons you have barked at them. Bark at them now for me." But he did not look at them again. Slowly, he walked to where I was standing and fell at my feet. I put my hand on his chest. I could feel his heart beating, but it beat only twice. Very slowly, loud and hollow like the waves on the beach, and then no more. "Rontu!" I cried. "Oh, Rontu!" I buried him on the headland. I dug a hole in the crevice of the rock, digging for 2 days from the dawn until the going down of the sun, and I put him there with some sandflowers and a stick that he liked to chase when I threw it, and I covered him with pebbles of many colors that I had gathered on the shore. Chapter 26. That winter I did not go to the reef at all. I ate the things that I had stored and left the house only to get water at the spring. It was a winter of strong winds and rain and wild seas that crashed against the cliffs, so I would not have gone out much even if Rontu had been there. During that time I made 4 snares from notched branches. In the summer once, when I was on my way to go to the place where the sea elephants lived, I'd seen a young dog that looked like Rontu. He was running with one of the packs of wild dogs, and though I caught only a glimpse of him, I was sure that he was Rontu's son. He was larger than the other dogs, and had heavier fur and yellow eyes, and he ran with a graceful stride like Rontu's. In the spring, I planned to catch him with the snares I was making. The wild dogs came to the headland often during the winter, now that Rontu was gone, and when the worst of the storms were over. I set the snares outside the fence, and I baited them with fish. I caught several of the dogs the first time, but not the one with the yellow eyes. And since I was afraid to handle them, I was forced to let them free. I made more snares, and I set these again. But while the wild dogs came close, they would not touch the fish. I did catch a little red fox, which bit me when I took her out of the snare, yet she soon got over her wildness and would follow me around in the yard begging for abalone. She was very much a thief. When I was away from the house, she always found some way to get into the food, no matter how well I hid it, so I had to let her go back to the ravine. Often, though, she would come at night and scratch the fence for food. I could not catch the young dog with a snare, and I was about to give up trying to, when I thought of the tulache weed, which we sometimes use to catch fish in the tide pools. It was not really a poison, but if you put it in the water, the fish would turn over on their backs and float. I remembered this weed and dug some of it where it grew on the far side of the island. I broke it up into small pieces, which I dropped in the spring where the wild dogs drank. I waited all day, and at dusk the pack came down to the spring. They drank their fill of the water, but nothing happened to them, or not much. They frisked around for a while as I watched them from the brush and trotted away. I then remembered zushel, which some of the men of our tribe used and is made from ground-up seashells and wild tobacco. I made a big bowl of this, mixing it with water, and put it in the spring. I hid in the brush and waited. The dogs came at dusk. They sniffed the water, and they backed off and looked at each other, but at last began to drink. Soon afterwards, they began to walk around in circles. Suddenly, they all lay down and went to sleep. There were 9 of them lying there by the spring, and in the dim light, it was hard to tell the one that I wanted to take home. But finally, I found him. He was snoring as if he had just eaten a big meal. I picked him up and hurried along the cliff, being frightened all the way that he would wake up before I reached the headland. I pulled him through the opening under the fence, and I tied him to it with a strap and left food beside him to eat and some fresh water. Before long, he was on his feet, gnawing through the strap. He howled and ran about the yard while I cooked my supper. All night he howled, but at dawn, when I went out of the house, he was asleep. While he lay there by the fence sleeping, I thought of different names for him, trying first one and then another, saying them over to myself. At last, because he looked so much like his father, I called him Rontu Aru, which means son of Rontu. In a short time, he made friends with me. He was not so large as Rontu, but he had his father's thick coat and the same yellow eyes. Often when I watched him chasing gulls on the sand spit or on the reef barking at the otter, I forgot that he was not Rontu. We had many happy times that summer, fishing and going to Tall Rock in our canoe, but more and more now I thought of Tutuk and my sister Ulape. Sometimes I would hear their voices in the wind, and often when I was on the sea in the waves that lapped softly against the canoe. Chapter 27. After the fierce storms of winter came many days when the wind did not blow. The air was so heavy that it was hard to breathe, and the sun was so hot that the sea was like a sun itself, too bright to look at. The last day of this weather, I took the canoe from the cave, and I paddled around the reef to the sandspit. I did not take Rontu Aru with me, for while he liked the cold, he did not like heat. It was good that he did not come with me. The day was the hottest of all, and the sea shimmered with red light. Over my eyes, I wore shields made of wool, with small slits in them to see through. No gulls were flying, the otter lay quiet in the kelp, and the little crabs were deep in their holes. I pulled the canoe up on the beach, which was wet but steaming from the sun. Early every spring, I took the canoe out to the sandspit, and I spread fresh pitch in the cracks that needed it. I worked all this morning, stopping from time to time to cool off in the sea. As the sun climbed high, I turned the canoe over and I crawled under it, and I went to sleep in the shade. I had not slept long when I was suddenly awakened by what I thought was thunder, but upon looking out from my shelter, I saw that there was no clouds in the sky. Yet the rumbling sound kept on. It came from a distance, from the south, and as I listened, it grew louder. I jumped to my feet, and the first thing that caught my gaze was the gleaming stretch of beach on the southern slope of the sandspit. Never in my life on the island had I seen the tide so low. Rocks and small reefs that I did not know were under the sea stood bare in the blinding light. It was like another place. I had gone to sleep, and I had awakened on another island. The air was suddenly tight around me. There was a faint sound as if some giant animal were sucking the air in and out through its teeth. The rumbling came closer out of an empty sky, filling my ears. Then, beyond the gleam of the beach and the bare rocks and reefs, more than a league beyond them, I saw a great white crest moving down upon the island. It seemed to move slowly between the sea and the sky, but it was the sea itself. I tore off the shields that I wore over my eyes, and in terror, I ran along the sandspit. I ran, and I stumbled, and I got up, and I ran again. The sand shuddered under my feet as the first wave struck. Spray fell around me like rain. It was filled with pieces of kelp and small fish. By following the curve of the sandspit, I could reach the cove and the trail that led to the mesa, but there was no time for this. Water was already rushing around my knees, pulling me from every direction. The cliff rose in front of me, and though the rocks were slippery with sea moss, I found a hold for a hand and then a foot. Thus, a step at a time, I dragged myself upward. The crest of the wave passed under me and roared on towards Coral Cove. For a time there was no sound, and then the sea began to seek its old place, running backward in long, foaming currents. Before it could do so, another great wave moved out of the south. Perhaps it would be even bigger than the first one. I looked up. The cliff rose straight above me. I could climb no farther. I stood facing the rock with my feet on a narrow ledge, and one hand thrust deep into a crack. Over my shoulder I could see the wave coming. It did not come fast, for the other wave was still running out. For a while, I thought that it would not come at all because the two suddenly met beyond the sandspit. The first wave was trying to reach the sea, and the second one was struggling toward the shore. Like two giants, they crashed against each other. They rose high in the air, bending first one way and then the other, and there was a roar as if great spears were breaking in battle, and in the red light of the sun, the spray that flew around them looked like blood. Slowly, the second wave forced the first one backward, rolled slowly over it, and then, as a victor drags the vanquished, moved in towards the island. The wave struck the cliff, and it sent long tongues streaming around me so that I could neither see nor hear. The tongues of water licked into all the crevices, dragged at my hand and at my bare feet, gripping the ledge. They rose high above me along the face of the rock, up, and then sent themselves against the sky and fell back, hissing past me to join the water rushing on toward the cove. Suddenly, all around me was quiet. In the quiet, I could hear my heart pounding, and I knew that my hand was still in its hold on the rock and that I was still alive. Night came, and though I was afraid to leave the cliff, I knew that I would never stay there until morning, that I would go to sleep and fall. Neither could I find my way home, so I climbed down from the ledge and crouched at the foot of the cliff. Dawn was windless and hot. The sandspit was strewn with the hills of kelp. Dead fish and lobsters and pink crabs lay everywhere, and two small whales were stranded against the rock walls of the cove. Far up the trail that led to the mesa, I found things from the sea. Rantu Aru was waiting at the fence. When I crawled under it, he jumped up upon me and followed me around, never letting me out of his sight. I was glad to be home on the high headland where the waves had not come. I had been gone only from one sun to the next, yet it was like many suns, like the time I had gone away in the canoe. Most of the day I slept, but I had many dreams, and when I awoke, everything around me was strange. The sea made no sounds on the shore. The gulls were quiet. The earth seemed to be holding its breath as though it were waiting for something terrible to happen. At dusk, I was coming back from the spring with a basket of water on my shoulder, walking along the cliff with Rantu Aru. Everywhere the ocean was smooth and yellow. It lay against the island as if it were very tired. The gulls were still quiet, perched on their rocky nests. Slowly, the earth began to move. It moved away from my feet, and for a moment, I seemed to be standing in the air. Water tipped out of the basket and trickled over my face. Then the basket fell to the ground. Not knowing what I did, thinking foolishly that another wave was upon me, I began to run. But it was a wave of earth, and it rippled under me along the cliff. As I ran, another wave overtook me. Looking back, I saw many of them coming out of the south like waves in the sea. The next thing I remember is I was lying on the ground, and Rantu Aru was beside me, and we were both trying to get to our feet. Then we were running again toward the headland, toward a house that kept moving off in the distance. The opening under the fence had caved in, and I had to pull rocks away before we could crawl through. Night came, but the earth still rose and fell like a great animal breathing. I could hear rocks tumbling from the cliff, falling down into the sea. All night, as we lay there in the house, the earth trembled and rocks fell, yet not the big one on the headland, which would have fallen if those who make the world shake had really been angry with us. And in the morning the earth was quiet once more, and a fresh wind that smelled of kelp blew out of the northern sea. Chapter 28. The earthquake did little damage. Even the spring, which failed to flow for several days, started up again and flowed more than ever. But the great waves had cost me all the food and the weapons which were stored in the cave, as well as the canoe that I had been working on, and those hidden under the south cliffs. The canoes were the biggest loss. To find enough wood to make another would have taken me all the spring and summer. I therefore set out on the first fair morning to search for whatever wreckage that the waves had washed ashore. Among the rocks near the south cliffs, I found a part of one canoe, buried in sand and twisted kelp. I worked all morning to dig it free, and then, having scraped it clean, could not decide what to do. I could cut the sinews and carry the planks up the cliff 2 at a time on my back and across the dunes to Coral Cove, which meant many days, or I could build the canoe here on the rocks and take the chance that another storm would wash it away before I was finished. I finally did neither of these things. Choosing a day when the sea was calm, I floated what was left of the canoe and pushed it in front of me and made my way past the sandspit and into the cove. There I took the wreckage apart and moved the planks up the trail beyond the place where the great waves had reached. I found the remains of my other canoe. It had been washed far back in the cave, and I could not get it out. So I went back to the south cliffs, and I hunted among the piles of kelp until I had enough pieces of wood, counting what I already had to begin the building of another. It was late in the spring now. The weather was still unsettled, with light rain falling most of the days, but I started the new canoe anyway, for I needed it to gather shellfish. No longer did I think of the Aleuts, as I have said, yet without a canoe to go where I wanted, I felt uneasy. The planks were all about the same size, the length of my arm, but they came from different canoes and were therefore hard to fit together. The holes were ready, however, which saved me much labor and time. Another help was that the great waves had washed ashore long strings of black pitch, which was often difficult to find on the island, and that which I needed. When I had sorted out the planks and shaped them, the work went fast, so that by late spring I was ready to finish the seams. It was on a windy morning that I made a fire to soften the pitch. The wind was cold, and it took a long time to get the fire going. To hasten it, I went down to the beach for dry seaweed. I had started back with my arms filled when I turned to look at the sky, thinking from the feel of the wind that a storm might be close. Off to the north the skies were clear, but in the east, from whence storms sometimes came at this season, stood banks of gray clouds, one on top of the other. At this moment, in the deep shadows cast by the clouds, I saw something else. Forgetting that I was carrying a load of seaweed, I threw up my arms. The seaweed fell to the ground. A sail, a ship, was there on the sea, halfway between the horizon and the shore. By the time I had reached the headland, it was much closer, moving quickly on the strong wind. I could see that it did not have the red, beaked prow of the Aleuts, nor did it look like the white men's ship, which I clearly remembered. Why had it come to the island of the Blue Dolphins? I crouched on the headland and wondered, my heart beating fast, if the men who sailed it had come to catch otter. If they were hunters, I must hide before they saw me. They would soon find my fire and the canoe that I was making, yet I could go to the cave and probably be safe from them. But if they had been seen by my people to take me away, then I should hide. If they had been sent by my people to take me away, then I should not hide. The ship moved slowly between the black rocks and into Coral Cove. I could see the men now, and they were not Aleuts. They lowered a canoe, and 2 of the men paddled towards the beach. The wind had begun to blow hard, and then the men had trouble landing. Finally, one of them stayed behind in the canoe, and the other, the man without a beard, jumped into the water and came along the beach and up the trail. I could not see him, but after a while I heard a shout, and then another, and I knew that he had found my fire and the canoe. The man he had left in the canoe did not answer, nor did the men on the ship, so I was sure that he was calling to me. I crawled down from the rock, and I went to the house. Since my shoulders were bare, I put on my otter cape. I took my cormorant skirt and the abalone box in which I kept my necklace and earrings. With Rontuaru, I then went along the trail that led to Coral Cove. I came to the mound where my ancestors had sometimes camped in the summer. I thought of them and of the happy times spent in my house on the headland, of my canoe lying unfinished beside the trail. I thought of many things, but stronger was the wish to be where people lived, to hear their voices and their laughter. I left the mound and the green grass growing on it among the white shells. I could no longer hear the man calling, so I began to run. When I came to the place where the two trails met, where I had built my fire, I found the footsteps the man had left. I followed them down to the cove. The canoe had gone back to the ship. The wind was screaming now, and the mist blew in across the harbor, and waves began to pile up on the shore. I raised my hand and shouted. I shouted over and over, but the wind carried my voice away. I ran down the beach and waded into the water. The men did not see me. Rain started to fall, and the wind drove it against my face. I waded farther out through the waves, raising my arms to the ship. Slowly, it moved away in the mist. It went toward the south, and I stood there until it was out of sight. Chapter 29, final chapter. After 2 more springs had gone, on a morning of white clouds and calm seas, the ship came back. At dawn, I saw it from the headland, far out on the horizon. When the sun was overhead, it lay anchored in Coral Cove. Until the sun went down, I watched from the headland, while the men made a camp on the shore and built a fire. Then I went to my house. All night I did not sleep, thinking of the man who had once called to me. I had thought of his voice calling for a long time since the night of the storm when the ship had sailed away. Every day during these 2 springs and 2 summers, I'd gone to the headland and watched, always at dawn and again at dusk. In the morning I smelled smoke from their fire, and I went down to the ravine and bathed in the spring and put on my otter cape and my cormorant skirt. I put on the necklace of black stones and black earrings. With the blue clay, I made the marks of our tribe across my nose. And then I did something that made me smile at myself. I did what my older sister Ulape had done when she had left the island of the Blue Dolphins. Below the mark of our tribe, I carefully made the sign which meant that I was still unmarried. I was no longer a girl, yet I made it anyway, using the blue clay and some white clay for the dots. I went back to the house then, and I built a fire and cooked food for Rantuaru and me. I was not hungry, and he ate my food and his too. "We're going away," I said to him, "away from our island." But he only put his head to one side, as his father often had done. And when I said no more, he trotted out to a sunny place and lay down and fell asleep. Now that the white men had come back, I could not think of what I would do when I went across the sea, or make a picture of it in my mind of the white men and what they did there, or see my people who had been gone so long. Nor, thinking of the past, of the many summers and winters and springs that had gone, could I see each of them. They were all one, a tight feeling in my breast, and nothing more. The morning was full of sun. The wind smelled of the sea and the things that lived in it. I saw the men long before they saw the house on the headland, far off on the dunes to the south. There were 3 of them, 2 tall men, and one who was short and wore a long gray robe. They left the dunes and came along the cliff, and then seeing the smoke from the fire, which I kept burning, they followed it, and at last they reached my house. I crawled under the fence, and I stood facing them. The man in the gray robe had a string of beads around his neck, and at the end of it was an ornament of polished wood. He raised his hand, and he made a motion towards me, which was the shape of the ornament that he wore. Then one of the 2 men who stood behind him spoke to me. His words made the strangest sounds I had ever heard. At first I wanted to laugh, but I bit my tongue. I shook my head and I smiled at him. He spoke again, slowly this time, and though his words sounded the same as before and meant nothing to me, they now seemed sweet. They were the sound of a human voice, and there is no sound like this in all the world. The man lifted his hand, and he pointed towards the cove and made a picture in the air of what could have been a ship. To this I nodded myself and pointed to the 3 baskets that I placed by the fire, making a gesture of taking them with me to the ship. Also the cage in which I had put the 2 young birds. There were many gestures before we left, though the 2 men spoke among themselves. They liked my necklace, the cape, and the cormorant skirt that shone in the sun. But when we got to the beach, where their camp was, the first thing that the man who spoke the most did was to tell the other men to make me a dress. I knew that this was what he said because one of them stood in front of me and held up a string from my neck to my feet and across my shoulders. The dress was blue. It was made of 2 trousers, just like the white men were wearing. The trousers were cut up into pieces, and then one of the men sat down with a rock and put them together again with white string. He had a long nose, which looked like the needle that he used. He sat all afternoon on the rock, and the needle went back and forth, in and out, flashing in the sun. From time to time, he would hold up the dress and nod his head as if he were pleased. I nodded as if I were pleased too, but I was not. I wanted to wear my cormorant skirt and my otter cape, which were much more beautiful than the thing that he was making. The dress reached from my throat to my feet, and I did not like it, either the color of it or the way that it scratched. It was also hot, but I smiled and put my cormorant skirt away in one of the baskets to wear when I got across the sea, sometime when the men were not around. The ship stayed in Coral Cove 9 days. It had come for Otter, but the Otter had gone. Some must have been left, after all, who remembered the Aleuts, for on the morning there were none to be seen. I knew where they had gone. They had gone to Tall Rock, but when the men showed me the weapons that they had brought to kill the Otter, I shook my head and I acted as though I did not understand. They pointed to my otter cape, but I still shook my head. I asked them then about the ship that had taken my people away many years before, making the sign of the ship and pointing to the east, but they did not understand. Not until I came to Mission Santa Barbara and met Father Gonzalez did I learn from him that this ship had sunk in a great storm soon after it reached his country, and that on the whole ocean thereabouts was no other. For this reason the white men had not come back for me. On the 10th day we sailed. It was a morning of blue skies and no wind, and we went straight toward the sun. For a long time I stood and I looked back at the island of the Blue Dolphins. The last thing I saw of it was the high headland. I thought of Rontu lying there beneath the stones of many colors, and of Wanane, wherever she was, and the little red fox that would scratch in vain at my fence, and my canoe hidden in the cove, and of all the happy days. Dolphins rose out of the sea and swam before the ship. They swam for many leagues in the morning through the bright water, weaving their foamy patterns. The little birds were chirping in their cage, and Rontu Aru sat beside me. And guys, that does it for the Island of the Blue Dolphins. There is a little author's note at the back, and it's really interesting to hear a little bit more about the true story that inspired this one. The island called in this book the Island of the Blue Dolphins was first settled by Indians in about 2000 BC, but it was not discovered by white men until 1602. In that year, the Spanish explorer Sebastian Vizcaino set out from Mexico in search of a port where treasure galleons from the Philippines could find shelter in case of distress. Sailing north along the California coast, he sighted the island, sent a small boat ashore, and named it La Isle de San Nicolas, in honor of the patron saint of sailors, travelers, and merchants. As the centuries passed, California changed from Spanish to Mexican hands. The Americans arrived, but only occasionally hunters visited the island. Its Indian inhabitants remained in isolation. The girl Robinson Crusoe, whose story I have attempted to recreate, actually lived alone upon the island from 1835 to 1853, and is known to history as the Lost Woman of San Nicolas. The facts about her are few. From the reports of Captain Hubbard, whose schooner carried away the Indians of Gallisat, we know that the girl did jump into the sea, despite efforts to restrain her. From the records left by Captain Nidaver, we know that he found her 18 years later alone with a dog in a crude house on the headland, dressed in a skirt of cormorant feathers. Father Gonzalez of Santa Barbara Mission, who befriended her after her rescue, learned that her brother had been killed by wild dogs. He learned little else, for she spoke to him only in signs. Neither he nor any of the Indians at the mission could understand her strange language. The Indians of Gallisat had long since disappeared. The lost woman of San Nicolas is buried on a hill near the Santa Barbara Mission. Her skirt of green cormorant feathers was sent to Rome. Outermost of the 8 Channel Islands, San Nicolas is about 75 miles southwest of Los Angeles. For years, historians thought that it had been settled some 6 centuries ago, but recent carbon-14 tests of excavations on the island show that the Indians came here from the north long before the Christian era. There are images of the creatures of the land, sea, and air, similar to those found on the shores of Alaska, and carved with extraordinary skill, may be seen at the Southwest Museum in Los Angeles. The future of San Nicolas is not clear. It is now a secret base of the United States Navy, but scientists predict that because of the pounding waves and furious winds, it will one day be swept back into the sea. In the writing of Island of the Blue Dolphins, I am deeply indebted to Maud and DeLoss Lovelace, to Bernice Eastman Johnson of the Southwest Museum, and to Fletcher Carr, formerly curator at the San Diego Museum of Man. guys, I surely hope that you've enjoyed Island of the Blue Dolphins, and we will be reading another book to end the year, and we'll be voting on that soon. So take care. Bye.